All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our great webinar on 5 key strategies for creating a hybrid and a culture of L&D in your workforce. Happy to be here. We have some fantastic guests collaborating with us on this webinar. So let's get at it. All right. So before we start, I wanted to present to you Hybo. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a very modern HRIS, or like our CEO Ronnie likes to say, we want to be the last HRIS your organization would ever want to purchase. To give you an example, we have clients that we signed when they were with 70 employees, and today they're after an IPO with 3,000. And those are the right type of companies that we go and work with, really modern hypergrowth companies. And I think the same goes for our partners that I'll present in a second. Here's, some of our great clients that work with us, from Bob to Leo Vegas to Fever to Monday.com, and lots of amazing companies we get to collaborate and learn from. And this was, 2 seconds about Hybo. And I want to present to you Nelson from How Now.
Thanks, Jos. And similarly, I'd like to steal Ronnie's words and say we're going to be the last learning platform anyone ever buys. But for us, it's a learning platform that puts people front and center of the learning experience. And it's really focused around reducing the friction with onboarding, upskilling, and supporting people at scale, and especially in the hybrid world that we live in now and the challenges we're going to discuss throughout the webinar. And so it's really a learning experience platform for high growth companies who really want to put invest in their people and help them grow.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And together we also have here Ali, and I'll let her present herself.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Ali. I'm a leadership coach and facilitator. So I've been working in L&D for most, if not pretty much all of my career, but I've got a particular interest in leadership development. So that's where I spend most of my time now. I live down right on the south coast of the UK in Brighton. And also most of my time, actually, including most of the night, is spent with 2 very young boys. So I have an almost 5-year-old and an almost 1-year-old. So lots to keep me busy.
The sleepless night club.
Yeah.
I hear you and I feel you. Luckily, my boys are a bit older, so I've been there and done that. All righty, let's jump right in. Okay, so here are some themes and questions we decided would be super interesting for today. And let's start with this one, around the key things that you need to consider when you're designing a new skill building program in this new hybrid setting that we're all becoming to call the new normal. So maybe this one would be a good one for you to pick up, Nelson.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to start with is to ask, do you need a program? This often reminds me of, the guy with the hammer sees everything and it's a nail. That's typically what the kind of L&D program course is. It's even before there's a problem, they've already decided it's going to be a program and a course, and that's not really the way we should be approaching this. We often talk about the 4 rights, and these are the 4 things to think about when you're building essentially a learning experience that's going to solve a problem for the people in your organization. The first right is the right resource. And that could be many things. It could be just a short video. It could be a job aid. It could be a live synchronous session similar to what we're doing now. It could be a coaching session. There's a whole ecosystem of learning resources that you can choose from. And it's not just limited to a program or course. And then it's connecting that right resource to the right person. And so this is where you've got 2 ways of doing this. One is the age-old push learning. And there's the kind of narrative that completely dismisses push learning, but I don't think that's fair. There is room for push learning when it's done right. And by doing it right, I mean when you use data to segment your target audience in a meaningful way to connect with, and also creating a space where people pull the most relevant learning resources. And then the third one is around right time. And this is often the one that gets overlooked, where people think about kind of personalizing learning by connecting the right resource to the right person, but it's useless if you don't connect it with their moment of need. It's like telling someone how to do a VLOOKUP 3 months before they've ever logged into Excel, and it has no meaning to them. And so it's about making sure you can connect it with them at the right time. So, for example, if I'm a sales rep, maybe I need to know this knowledge when I'm inside my CRM. So how can you use learning technology to make it accessible in my moment of need within the apps where I'm already working? And the last one, and a critical one, because none of the other three will be right without this one being right, and it's right impact. And it's making sure your learning experiences are driving the measurable performance improvement that you want to see. And that's not an afterthought. That comes at the very beginning of building a learning experience in a hybrid world. So right resource to the right person at the right time to drive the right impact. And they're the 4 things to think about when you're thinking about building learning experiences in a hybrid world.
Nice. And I think, it goes really well with what, Josh Bersin always says, which, learning should be in the flow of work, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think maybe I would add one thing which I noticed, which was super important from the days I was doing a bit more L&D, which was always, users were always thinking about what's in it for me, right? Because otherwise it's really hard to build on the skills and to build on making sure that this becomes a habit which is worth your while, because we're all so busy today, right? We're juggling home, working from home, kids in the house. It's really hard to create those habits as well. Any thoughts on this one as well, Ali?
Yeah, it was interesting when you're saying there around thinking about who that end user is. And I quite often have to, and I test myself this, but also thinking about with clients, are we delivering an intervention based on something we think that learner needs, or are we delivering something based on what they actually want? And there's a key difference, and it goes back to us as practitioners thinking about that first conversation that we're having with our stakeholders and really defining what those outputs really look like, but also having, I guess, some of those more candid conversations where we're able to challenge and ask why. Why is it that output that you're looking for? Where are we right now? And is this intervention the right thing that's going to give you the outcome that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And to add to that, you have 5 generations in the workforce today. You have people in their 20s, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and I even saw in my former company people in their 70s coming back to the workforce. So it's super critical to have, tailored solutions that are not one systems fits all type of mentality, because those days are over.
Yes.
Do you agree with that, Nelson?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one size never fit no one. So, and I think that is definitely true in the case of learning. And then going back to your earlier point, I mean, the moment of need is such an important aspect of the learning experience, because we're most motivated to learn in that moment of need. And the best example of that is Google, right? When you need to find out something, you'll go, you'll search for it, you'll find it, you're more likely to engage with it, and you're more likely to apply it because you're in the moment of need. And too often learning experiences are designed at the convenience of the L&D schedule rather than around the moment of need, and putting people first, putting them in the front and center of that learning experience.
I agree. That's a very, very important point. All righty, let's move to number 2. So how can I create a sense of community and belonging with remote learning, right? Especially today, this becomes so important. What do you think about this one, Ali?
I think there's so many things that we can do because technology is so readily available for us. But thinking about what does that community look like? What do we want it to look? What do we want it to feel like? And then using different pieces of technology to connect different people. So recognizing that if we're thinking about remote learning, it's, am I there as a user that's logging on at the touch of a button on my phone? Am I looking to join a webinar where there's going to be other participants joining, but from somewhere else in the world? And thinking about how do we create those communities around that? Is that Slack groups? Is that around kind of taking some of the learns from social media where we like things or we comment, where we're able to share the materials and the resources that are of interest to us? And I guess leaning on some of those pieces of technologies to enable that.
Nice. And I think, from the LXP side, right, it's really strong on social learning, right, Nelson?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two people challenges that have kind of come about as a result of working remotely and working hybrid. The first one is companies all of a sudden realized how much knowledge was being unintentionally shared in the workplace, right? How much there was kind of osmosis and overhearing things and tapping on people's shoulder. So the moment we had to work from home, people were like, where do I go to get this stuff? I need to keep calling someone. I need to keep interrupting someone through Slack. So that was the first challenge they realized. And the second challenge people realized was fostering those meaningful relationships between colleagues became harder because there wasn't the kind of informal water cooler conversations and that wasn't happening. Both of those people challenges can be solved through learning and by empowering people in the organization to teach and learn from each other, right? Because not only does that help foster relationships between colleagues, because we're learning from each other, that gives us an opportunity to communicate with each other and better understand who we are. But it also addresses this issue of one of the biggest problems companies have is if you imagine someone who's been in the company for 4 years and then they leave, all of the good stuff they've learned leaves with them. So you basically have a leaky bucket problem. And by enabling knowledge sharing, you're making sure more of that knowledge is retained within the organization. And this is where, a learning experience platform isn't the only way of doing it. Like Ali mentioned, there are definitely ways of doing it, like Slack, etc., are ways of doing it. But a learning experience platform definitely reduces the friction to be able to do that faster and more effectively.
And I think also measure, I worked in the days where, predominantly LMSs were, the leading L&D teams tool of the moment, right? And the biggest problem with them that it was always top-down driven. And we both know that I certainly don't learn like that. When I'm cycling to my office here in Amsterdam, I'm listening to podcasts. When I go on a run, I listen to audiobooks. We read blogs. We do so many things that are as important to our careers and to our skills building than what the top-down driven learning is, that, we need to account and measure for everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the more we have those measures, the more we can see what's working for our teams and our organizations. And it enables that agility piece for us to pivot based on the types of learnings and those types of interventions that our people are engaging with. So I think from a return on investment perspective, when we think about getting bang for our buck, we're spending it where it matters. And we can back that up with those data and insights, which is so important.
Yeah, and you're also checking whether actually people are using that content that you deemed proper and maybe you think is great, but actually your users don't like it. I don't know. I think, I've been in many places.
And that's where the community is really powerful, right? Because the community almost moderates and curates content itself. It's not, when one of my colleagues likes something or comments on something or shares it, already that curates content from an ocean of stuff that's available. It's been pre-filtered by the fact that a colleague has deemed this relevant for me because we're in the same space and maybe we do the same job. And so this is where I think often we talk about creating efficiencies in L&D, but actually we should also be looking at creating leverage, where how do you leverage this community to maximize impact rather than keeping the impact the same and trying to cut costs and make it more efficient. And I think that's where data and community can really play a huge, huge role.
Yeah, and if not, you're also missing on virality, right?
Sure.
I can tell you that I've seen clients that adopted several approaches. One is like, okay, let's restrict content creation just to the L&D team or the managers. And then there were others which I saw and they had amazing engagement. They said, let's give everybody the ability to create and engage. And then the AI and the engines just pick up on the good stuff that is constantly being shared and liked and commented and tagged. And the rest just flows below. So you don't need to be afraid to give, voices to your employees.
Absolutely.
It always worries me when an organization is more comfortable with accepting AI-driven recommendations rather than learner-driven learning. If we can't trust our own humans to go find what they learn, but we're more than happy for a machine to decide what they learn, we've got something seriously wrong there.
Yeah, we became a bit lazy sometimes. I think we all recognize the fact that sometimes we're on Netflix for like 40 minutes without actually having seen nothing because there's so much abundance of this massive buffet, and you're like, oh, where to start?
Yeah,
So you need a mix of both.
for sure.
Awesome. All right. So what is psychology safety and how do we promote it within the organization? I think this one maybe is right up your alley, Ali.
It is right, Ali. Ali. Yeah, psychological safety, it's such an interesting concept, but if we're thinking about it in the sphere of learning and creating a learning culture, I'm a big believer that actually any of the interventions that we're choosing to deploy are going to be limited in their impact if people don't feel safe to access them. So what do we mean when we say psychological safety? Well, I guess in essence, it's around that feeling of security and safety that I can be my full self at work. I can take some of those interpersonal risks. So I feel confident to give my colleague feedback. I feel comfortable to receive feedback. And I guess I feel from that community's perspective, a sense of belonging. So if we're thinking about creating that real learning culture, this for me is the place to start. And thinking about this really does have to come from the top down, is thinking about what are the behaviors that we're setting at a leadership level. What are the behaviors as a manager that I'm demonstrating that are going to enable this psychological safety to really be fostered and to grow. So thinking about how often do I ask my team to give me feedback as a manager? How often am I the last person to speak? So I'm giving everybody else that voice first without that kind of status piece coming into play where my manager said this, so they're probably right. And I guess what we're really trying to do is encourage that diversity of thought. So we're leaning on a breadth of ideas, and that osmosis piece, Nelson, that you mentioned just happens really organically. And that only works when there's psychological safety. So my first tip whenever anybody's looking to create a bit more of a learning culture is, what does your psychological safety look like and what are you going to do about it?
And just to add to what Ali said, failing is a part of the learning process, right? You learn something, you try it out, you make a mistake, you get feedback, you learn from that, and you keep iterating and you keep improving. And without psychological safety, you will always be afraid to fail, because of the repercussions of failing. So, you could go go learn something, read a book, you come back and you want to apply it in your day-to-day work. But if you have a culture where your manager is going to give you a real big telling off for trying that thing and getting it wrong, that will put you off ever learning something new and trying it out. And so you can't have a continuous learning culture without psychological safety. And it becomes even more important in a hybrid world where you sometimes don't get the body language, right? All we see of most of us right now is kind of this top half. And so it limits what you can read from the room. And so we need to almost over communicate to create that psychological safety and to create a space where people know they can, what the saying is, not trial and terror, but trial and error. That's what psychological safety gets you.
Yeah,
I like that one. I'll adopt the trial and terror one.
Love a saying. We can put them in our toolboxes, right? I think also reflecting on that as a learning practitioner is that moving or shifting to this hybrid way of delivering learning interventions can feel quite scary. It's quite new. And how do I balance the needs of those? For example, we're delivering an intervention where we have some people that were traditionally in the classroom and some people that are accessing that same learning, but now we're doing it over perhaps Zoom. It is thinking about actually, as a learning practitioner, I need to feel safe to try things. Like, I've run hybrid programs. They did not go great the first time, right? But we have to start somewhere. And if we don't start, we never actually get any progress. And I think at an organizational level, accepting that we have to try things, we have to see how they go, and that's exactly how we learn. That is the learning and experiential learning cycle in itself.
Yeah, and I think, I underestimated this question, and this is so crucial because without this, you can't create a learning culture.
Yeah,
This is a must-have. It's not optional. And I can tell you, I had the privilege of working with the L&D team at Unilever, and their CEO, he was amazing, and he told all the employees, he said, "Hey, we're changing course every quarter almost. The world is ever changing. I cannot promise you you'll have a job, but I can promise you I'll give you the best system out there to upskill yourselves and reskill yourselves constantly to be relevant in today's workforce." And that's, I think, such a beautiful thing to say to the organization. So when he bought an LXP to their organization, he brought it to the entire org, including the blue collar employees. So people in the plants, all the workers have the same access to all of their learning content. And that's amazing. And I think that's what companies should strive for.
Absolutely.
All right. Next one. Isn't hybrid L&D harder to manage than remote L&D? I think we're all kind of like settling into this new hybrid model, and I think UK are a bit ahead of us with opening up everything as of today, which is fantastic. I'm super envious of that, I can tell you. But the new hybrid is becoming the new normal. So maybe from your side, Nelson, how are you tackling this, both from a vendor perspective and also from the CEO of probably a hybrid organization today?
Yeah, so I think as a business and then as an organization, I think we've always followed a hybrid suit in terms of, people were working from home. Sometimes they'll be in the office. I mean, if anything, it's just tipped probably more in one direction, where we spend less days in the office and more days working from home or wherever you feel comfortable. And I think it's a running theme. That theme of flexibility and autonomy is what now extends to learning in the hybrid world. Is if I want autonomy over how and where I work, what makes you think I don't want autonomy over how, where, and when I learn? And I think it's applying the same principles and mindset to building this learning culture in a hybrid way. Now, it's harder because we're changing, and any change is hard. I don't think it's hard in itself. It's this transition that companies need to go through, especially if you're a company that was, say 90% of what you were doing was training that happened in a classroom. Then, of course, shifting to a hybrid model is going to be challenging. But the way to treat it is start with a blank canvas. It's a great opportunity. As they say, the pandemic has given us all an opportunity to reset the way we do things. Maybe bad habits that have been passed on for years and years. Now's a chance to kind of wipe the slate clean and start afresh and ask the questions for why were we doing that? In the same way we're asking ourselves, why was I commuting an hour and a half both ways to get into one meeting and go back? Those are the questions we need to ask for learning. So it's harder to change. But do I think in the long run, it will be easier, more effective, and it will free up L&D to focus on more strategic ways of driving business performance rather than losing time and energy in admin that wasn't really adding any value? I think in the long run, we're all going to be better off.
Yeah,
I think from
absolutely.
today's perspective, yeah, just a second, Ali, just to chime on this one, because it's so crucial, from the admin perspective, right? Having the ability to create on your own without having to go to external consultants or other people is so important. We all expect our tools to be as, easy from the admin perspective and as stellar as any app we're using on our phones from a user perspective. So that's really key on all purposes. And I think this is where we found this partnership with you guys so intriguing, because we both have that same mentality, and this is crucial. And if you think about the pandemic, right, in 1 month, 1.2 billion students went online. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ali.
No, just listening to both of you there, but I also think there's such an opportunity, and you're right that as learning practitioners we favor the parts of the role that we really enjoy, whether that be kind of the data stuff or the facilitation or the design. But actually it enables us it's forced us to really switch and pivot and thinking about what are the needs of the actual learner and how can I design and deliver those interventions that are actually going to meet their needs. So really thinking about those different learning styles, the time zones that we're working within, how accessible are we making learning? And I think this hybrid way of working, whilst if I think back to the beginning of March, 2020, and we all got thrown in it, and it was kind of that panic mode. How are we going to approach this? But we got through it, right? We're working from home just feels absolutely normal. And none of us want to, well, I say none of us, most of us don't want to commute 90 minutes one way for an hour meeting. And that absolutely is the same from a learning capacity, but really thinking about, as an individual, can I hold that mirror up, and what are the things that I'm scared about, and is that why I'm thinking it's hard? And flipping that and thinking about what are the needs of the person that I'm trying to serve.
And one of my favorite things to come out of this is, I think, like Ali said, when we went into lockdown, we're now having to make things happen remotely. I think a lot of people who needed to get online, turned to look at the LMS that they had bought a few years ago. They were using it for a bit of compliance training. Now they needed their LMS to do a lot more than just compliance. And that's when you realize the limitations of what you had bought. And it goes back to what you said earlier, Josh. I think it's the classic kind of buyer-user problem, where the buyer also happens to be the administrator. So when they're buying the product, they're overly looking at what problems it would solve for the administrator. And because the users aren't often involved in the buying process, you only later find out when actually it's a terrible user experience. And given the choice, your employees are not going to use it. And then this is what I think is really important for L&D functions to remember. Your biggest risk isn't buying a learning platform that doesn't do your admin. Your biggest risk is buying a learning platform that no one in your company wants to use. Because you can have the best admin functionality in the world, but if it's not adding value to the employees, it doesn't matter. And I think shifting to remote has really highlighted that for a lot of companies, where they realize actually this LMS isn't fit for purpose and we need something else that's going to support a more social, collaborative, continuous way of learning in the company.
Yeah, and if you think about it, LMS have been here for 2 or 3 decades. They were never designed for that experience. They were really designed with a big emphasis on the M, which is the management part. They were never designed to be engaging. They were designed to drive compliance, regulatory needs. And a lot of large companies would still need that LMS, right? But they have come to an understanding that they do need an LXP layer on top of that would connect all the ecosystem. So you have a lot of companies, especially the enterprise ones, that keep the old LMSs for their compliance part, but then they deliver learning through an LXP.
Yeah, actually.
And that's kind of like the new hybrid.
Exactly that, Jos. But what we're saying is, fair enough for enterprise. They might have embedded systems with their compliance, but there's no reason why a high growth, small, medium business today has to go down that route, right? There's no reason why you need multiple systems. And that's where we come in at How Now, is to say, you don't need to go down that route and tie yourself up with multiple systems just to get that end result. Actually, you can invest in something that prioritizes the learning experience whilst also supporting your core admin, compliance, regulatory requirements.
Yeah, I think there's a saying, we can scale things at work and we get momentum, or we can scale problems and they become quite painful.
Good point.
Awesome. All right, next in line. How do companies best build their people capabilities in a hybrid world? I think I'll start with this one, and I think it's a tough question to answer, right? Because there's so many things today. First of all, how do we measure capability? Do we break it down into competency frameworks? Are we talking about skills? What's a capability? I think it would be nice to hear from Ali. How do you define, for instance, the strategies to start talking the same language around capabilities within the workforce?
And it's a good question. I think there's a piece there for organizations at that strategy, almost at the vision piece, actually, before we get to strategy, is really thinking about where is it that we're trying to go and what is it that we're trying to achieve. And most organizations hopefully have that fairly well defined. And then thinking about how do we align the L&D piece to that, so that we're actually driving our people capabilities in the direction that's going to help us to achieve the organizational objectives. And then for me, it comes down to what do we have in place? What are the behaviors that we have at a leadership level that are going to help us to achieve that? What is it that we actually need so that we can really identify where that gap lies? And the same then really comes to some of those more kind of core competency-based things and thinking around what are the skill sets that we actually need to deliver the products that we want to deliver? What are the skill sets that we need to deliver the user experience or the customer experience that we're hoping to define? And actually, where are we now? So you're, again, almost doing this like constant MOT cycle around what are the skills that we need, actually, how are we performing against those? And then how am I going to design the learning interventions that help plug that gap? And thinking about that with the added layer of, I guess, hybrid is how has that shifted things for us as an organization, but also how does that shift the way that we want to access that learning, and how do we test that some of those capabilities are embedded within the organization?
Yeah, I think if your tools are modern, then hybrid shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I guess to support that modern approach is the mindset. I think that's important. It's like, you know, if you can have the latest bit of kit and, you know, you can have the best cars in the world, but if you haven't got a sat nav to guide you in the right direction, then you're not going anywhere. And so similarly, I think it's important to have that mindset, vision, direction, that kind of accompanies the tools. And I think one of the key mindsets for not just the hybrid world, but in the competitive environment that we live in now, where, you know, world is changing faster than ever before, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down, which means there's going to be new opportunities and there's going to be new risks and uncertainties. And the people who learn fast are going to be able to seize those opportunities and win. And the people who don't learn fast enough are going to essentially lose their best talent, go bust, and eventually lose. And we've seen that happen just in the last few years. And so from a mindset perspective, I think a core capability is the kind of agile ways of working, and going back to some of the things we've discussed, is the kind of openness of failing fast and learning from that and iterating and continuously improving and learning from that. I think that's critical in this hybrid world. And just today, for you to be able to grow and do what you're doing really successfully. And I think it's important to have an agile mindset, but also agile practices within the organization.
so at what point do you see, and maybe this is a question to you both, like at what point do you see companies that are in hyper growth stage, let's say they're above 100 employees, at what stage do you really think companies should be starting to look at capabilities and L&D? Because it takes a lot of time. Sometimes companies underestimate the effort and the thought you need to put into it to get it right. So at what stage do you think it's appropriate for companies to really dive into the world of L&D, LXPs, and growth and capabilities?
I mean, from my perspective, perhaps I'm being biased, but it's from day dot. You know, those capabilities change as you grow and as the organization pivots or scales. But actually, what I need right now as a team of 10 actually is I need people that can roll their sleeves up and that they can get stuck into different pies. But then actually, as we start to grow, I need to start putting in place processes and we start building out functions. And actually the capabilities that I then need that have got me from A to B are shifting from what I need to get from B to C. So I think it's naive to wait until that you're potentially at 100 people. I think perhaps the investment in terms of resources obviously would look significantly different. But I think having that as a foundational piece and something that at least has a voice that somebody contributes at the table from day one is important.
And to add to that, I mean, we work with companies all the way from 50 people to 100,000 people on the Fortune 500. So, and one of the common themes that we hear in our conversations is, I wish I'd done this earlier. It doesn't matter how big or small they are, they wish they had done this yesterday. And like Ali mentioned, it looks different for companies at different stages and different sizes. And you don't have to wait until you get it perfect, whatever that means, right? What you can do is there are definitely minimum viable ways of doing this. Even if your starting point is just understanding what skills you have and don't have in your teams. It's not that useful for, if I was, say, head of marketing or head of sales, it's not that useful for me to know, what courses or what learning you've been doing. What would be useful is to understand from a skills perspective, what skills do you believe you have as an individual? Then collectively, how do we rate your proficiency? How well do you think you've mastered this skill? And how well do I think you've mastered that? That will give us an indication, almost like any other KPI in the business. It gives you a numerical way of tracking this. So you can then start to, as the classic saying goes again, you manage what you measure. More importantly, you get what you measure. Right, is if you're not measuring skills, then you would never be able to achieve skills uplift because you weren't measuring it in the first place. So even if it was happening, you wouldn't know because you weren't measuring it. And I think that's why it's important to embed that into how your people function operates and how your company operates from day one.
Yeah. And that's crucial. And you start to see coins like the skills economy being, thrown out, or what are, the skills that we need to be successful. If you look at the PwC CEO report, which comes out year after year, out of the top 5, 3 are around skills. CEOs being worried that they don't have the skills to remain competitive in the next 5 years. And CEOs afraid of skills leaving the workforce, right? So being able to talk that language is crucial. So I couldn't agree more on this topic. Super, super important. All right. So how can I evaluate if our learning investment is optimized and that learning is effective? All right. Maybe we start with Ali on this one, and I'm sure Nelson will have a lot to say on this one as well.
So this is a real tough one, and I think it's the age-old question is, how do we measure that return on investment? And I don't really think there's a big piece of science behind this, unless we're looking at binary attendance. Does somebody do their compliance training? Yes or no. That gives us that kind of binary yes or no in terms of outputs. But actually, I think before we start thinking about how do I measure whether that learning is effective, it goes back to what's the conversations that I'm having with the stakeholders before I even get to that kind of defining the learning outcomes, or defining what that design piece looks like, and having those really candid conversations about why is it that you want feedback training, or why is it that we want to put in something around assertiveness? What is the actual thing you're hoping to get out of a particular intervention? And then really digging down to what their interpretation of that is. Once we really understand that, and even at an individual learner perspective, what are they hoping to take from it? That enables us to then design things that are actually meeting the needs of the user and our stakeholders. And I think once we've got to that piece and we're post-intervention, we can start looking at measuring things from a short, medium, and a long term. Thinking about those short terms. So the great happy sheets that we get at the end of a piece of learning, did you engage with it? Was it useful? But then thinking about some of those more medium and long-term pieces. And the role that the managers play here, I think, is absolutely key. Do you know what type of learning your team are accessing? Do you care? If you don't care, you absolutely should care, because it's the follow-up of the learning that is actually where we see the change. So what conversations are we having to enable self-reflection? What conversations are we having to, as a manager, I can give feedback to that individual around how the things that they're putting into place are actually coming into play. And I guess really that's not just a manager observations, but peer observations. So what's coming through on pieces of 360 feedback, what's coming through in terms of productivity, effectiveness, personal KPIs that people are working towards. And then we have those longer term pieces that as learning practitioners, we always want to run there first, but we can't quite get there. Is, what's the impact on engagement? How are we accessing perhaps internal net promoter scores, and looking at the questions around engagement, accessibility to learning. Retention is a key one. But I think it's important for us to recognize that, particularly with these long-term outputs, is they are not solely dependent on learning. And actually, that's just one piece of the puzzle. So actually, we need to be measuring an intervention at both that short, medium, and long term for us to really see the value of it.
I think from a C-suite perspective, there's always the before and after, right? I'm going to invest now. How does this affect my bottom line, right? If we're talking about what the CHRO or the CLO or the CEO are interested in. Maybe you have some insights on this one, Nelson.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to add to what Ali was saying, I think when we're designing learning experiences, we should look for these learning experiences to generate proof of impact. It should be thought of from the get-go when you're thinking about the learning experience. And proof of impact, I think, could be broken down into 3 types of proof. The first one being proof of knowledge. Now, this is what a lot of us already do. A lot of L&D already do this. Proof of knowledge is when you include a quiz or test in your learning experience. It just means it's like saying, I watched a video of someone riding a bike, and if you ask me questions, I could tell you, okay, you need to pedal first, and I can describe to you how you should ride a bike. And then the second one is proof of skill. Now, this is where I can apply that knowledge, and this is often where many L&D don't get to this point, where they create opportunities for you to be able to practice in a safe space and apply what you've learned. So going back to my bike analogy, this is me actually being given a bike, and I can ride that bike and show you I can ride that bike. And the third one, which is the trickiest but the most important one, is proof of performance. And this goes back to what you just mentioned there, Josh, which is I can now ride my bike from A to B, and I can get to the place of the outcome. And there, what you need is you need the baseline metric. So let's take the example that I'm trying to cut down the sales cycle for my sales team. And so the baseline is currently it's 3 months. Where we want to get to is a 2-month sales cycle. And so what you're tracking during that time is, are you improving that sales cycle? Now, like Ali mentioned, it isn't the classic case of correlation means causality. However, this is where you use qualitative data to interview your stakeholders, interview your learners. And in those interviews, if people say that learning experience did influence my behavior in the way I was selling, in the way I was negotiating, and that's what helps me close this deal faster, that is substantial enough data for you to make the relationship that this is a return on investment because it helped us cut down that sales cycle. And so I think it's those 3 proofs should be embedded in the learning experience from the get-go.
And I think, you always need to look at it like kind of like the upper part of the iceberg and the lower part. It's really hard to define the return on investment because the part which is below the sea level is much, much bigger. And there's so much return on investment on the second and third levels that are part of this learning experience that's where you need to focus. It's not just about direct saying, okay, I've saved money in less FTEs to deploy an L&D training. It's really about what goes beneath the surface. Awesome one. All right. What's the future of hybrid learning at work? Well, I can tell you from our perspective, I think it's like, it's learning is everything. We strive on learning, and we always say with the shelf life of skills getting shorter and shorter, you always need to learn. You cannot stop learning. So this is a must-have. How do you see this one, Ali?
I think for me, it's going to be more and more accessibility, and I want learning and I want it right now in this moment. And how accessible is that for me? So I think we're already seeing that. But if I take myself out of a work scenario, just as consumers in general, we're way less patient. We order something online and we want it on our doorstep 4 or 5 hours later. And I think actually that we're seeing that from a learning perspective. I'm going into a meeting where I'm having to deliver a presentation. All of a sudden, imposter syndrome hits. I don't know how to deliver a presentation, so I need to find out now. And that's just going to become, we're seeing it already. I think that's here to stay. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah. And it should be everywhere, right? So if that's the future of hybrid learning, then we all learn when we commute, when we run, when we work. It shouldn't be hard. It should be like any other habit we need to teach ourselves.
Yes.
Awesome. All righty. So let's talk about the 5 key strategies for creating a hybrid culture of L&D. So one, personalized learning. Okay, we all get it. I think that we have lots of people from multiple disciplines, even within the same age demographics, that some are digital nomads and some are completely analog, right? We need to be able to give that personalized learning experience. Anything on that one, Nelson?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this, I guess, in the earlier points, but the importance is no one's got time to learn for the sake of learning, and no one's definitely got time to learn things that are completely irrelevant to them. And so personalizing learning is critical. So essentially we should be doing less learning that achieves more, because more of what we're doing is relevant.
Awesome. So bite-sized learning, micro learning, every type of learning. Awesome. Then make learning a habit, right? There's tons of ways to do that. You can set time on your agendas to do it. I kind of like created this habit of when I'm running, I stop listening to music and I just use that to be my alone time to listen to podcasts. There's so many amazing podcasts and so many topics from marketing to sales to wellness to coaching to everything. Find your guru and start following them and create those great habits of learning. Anything from your side on this one, Ali?
It's just getting on and doing it. I think with any new habit, sometimes it feels a little bit jarring, and we have to force ourselves to do something if it's something that we're not used to doing. But actually, the more we do something, that those neural pathways get wider and actually they become easier to travel. So find the things that you enjoy. I guess it's like exercise. If you hate running, don't go running. But if you love swimming, use that and lean into the things that you enjoy. And access those communities, because there are communities in so many different mediums on almost anything that you can think of. But for me, it's just about getting started.
Yeah, and make it fun. If it's fun, people will do it. If it's easy, people will do it. If it's cumbersome, they won't, right?
Yeah, when did learning have to become boring? Right?
Exactly.
Kids learn through fun, just as we're adults, we're still kids at heart, right?
Definitely. It's so fun to learn new skills and actually get outside of your comfort zone, because maybe what's relevant today won't be relevant in the next future. Think about the top 5 requested jobs on LinkedIn did not exist 10 years ago. That's insane, right? And the world is changing. So you always need to be learning to stay relevant. All right. Number 3, get social. That's an easy one and a must-have. So get social, get a system that supports that and lets you add that social layer on learning, where your employees can start sharing ideas, sharing articles, podcasts, and all types of learning. Anything on that one, Nelson?
Just the fact that there are so many people, experts within your company, and experts doesn't mean they need to be of a high seniority, right? Seniority has nothing to do with this. People are experts in different things. So just look around you, and there's probably so much you can learn from them. And you've also got so much to give and share. And that's all social learning is. Just learn and teach each other.
Nice and have conversations. Just catch up with people socially, and that trying to create those opportunities for that osmosis that we perhaps lose that natural piece that happened in the office.
Yeah, and in the end, sharing is caring. So that's super key to foster that social ability. All right, number 4, create a learner-driven experience. I think that's a bit about tools and a lot about creating that culture within the company that fosters that psychological safety to create those systems where people feel free to learn, to fail, to iterate, and stop learning terror and go for learning and errors and have fun. What do you think about this one, Nelson?
Yeah, exactly what you said there, Jos. And I think it's important to empower people within the company to take shared ownership of their own development. I mean, there's different people like to go with binary schools of thought, like, just go bottom up and completely cancel out top down. I don't think that's the way. Because bottom up, you often end up learning the things that you're aware you need to learn. But sometimes we need to be guided for businesses to, and that's why L&D can be really powerful at spotting those gaps and saying, you might not realize you need to know this, but this is why you need to know this. And so I think it's important to have shared ownership, with managers taking ownership, but also each employee taking ownership of their own development.
And I'd argue that actually number 5 ties into this one, because if you as an L&D organization are able to measure these things, then it's easy for you to identify those gaps between what that learner-driven experience is and what top-down and bottom-up means. Any thoughts on that one, Ali?
Yeah, absolutely. The data here is key. And I'm going back to that experiential learning cycle, that we do something, we get some data, we then reflect upon that, and then we try again. But feedback is also such a key piece that we need to be getting at all of those data points, and thinking about what's the data telling us, but also if we're thinking about data from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective, what are the words that we're hearing? Also, what are we not hearing? And what are we seeing, and what are we not seeing? So I guess really leaning in and listening to the things that are said and not said, and using that to influence our decision making on all of those previous 4 points, really.
Nice one. Anything from your side on this one, Nelson?
No, it's critical. If you're not measuring, unfortunately, when budgets got tighter, things needed to be cut. In many organizations, it was L&D budgets that were cut. And often, if you look at those companies, it's companies where if all you were doing was, unfortunately, ticking the box and you couldn't prove the value you were adding, that's when your budgets get cut. And it doesn't have to be like that. And, often people associate L&D with a cost center. Actually, L&D done right is a value center at the very least, but it should be a profit center. They're closing the gaps that can help you drive the performance that helps you hit your goals. And so done right, that's where you need to be. And measuring and using data is a critical part of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in my former company, we had this quote, and we took one of the case studies, which was actually on Heinz Kraft. When they merged, they got bought by 3G, which is a massive investment firm, which is notorious for just cutting costs, right? And like you said, the first cost they cut was L&D and innovation, and then they stopped innovating to the market. And once they start innovating to the market and the new paradigm became innovation and change, the market just slashed their prices of their stocks, and they had to foresee a $16.4 billion loss for goodwill on lack of innovation.
Wow.
So that's a hard lesson learned on cutting on L&D. Awesome. I think this is nice to finish with, and then we can pass on to some questions that we're getting. So we have, I think, time for 2 questions. Am I wrong? So let's go for the first one. How can I make hybrid learning effective once Zoom fatigue completely sets in? Ouch. Yeah, we're all suffering from Zoom fatigue. And there are several tips and tricks I can give you from my life. One is turn off your self-view camera. Nobody likes to look at themselves for many hours a day. It's like having a mirror in front of you. So that's an easy one. On top of that, if you're thinking about Zoom fatigue, then learning can be effective in many ways. It doesn't have to be delivered via Zoom. There's lots of snippets on learning. There's tools like HowNow. You can have learning libraries, apps, games, and tons of other things to avoid Zoom fatigue, and also be flexible in terms of when people are learning. They can learn at almost any time using the right tools. Have I missed anything, Nelson?
Josh, I think that is quite comprehensive. You covered pretty much everything there.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, that was an easy one. Whew. All right. What are some ways our team can ensure time and space for the L&D team and the space to consolidate and reflect on what's being learned? Ooh, wow, that's a big question. Big questions. I leave it to you, Ali.
Thank you. It is a big question. And Nelson, you already mentioned it around like L&D not being a cost center. It's very much a growth engine, but the business has to absolutely believe that for this to happen. And that learning culture requires that commitment from the business, so that people can equally prioritize their learning alongside their other priorities. But if the business isn't pushing that as an agenda, then actually as an individual, how can I quantify investing my time and my learning when I should be investing it elsewhere. So for me, it's very much starts with what's the culture that we're setting, and how are we voicing and creating a space where people believe that they can make the decisions to invest their time wisely in their own development. And we talked about learning becoming a habit, and the more we do it, the easier it becomes. And that comes back to that kind of dual responsibility or accountability piece. So thinking about, as an individual, how can I access the learning that I enjoy? But then also, how am I being held accountable for that? So as a manager, what conversations am I having with my team in terms of the types of things that they're interested in, the types of learning that they're accessing? Am I giving somebody a learning budget? You know, we talk about it with pounds or dollar signs, but do we also talk about learning budgets in terms of time investments and what we expect people to be spending in terms of their own growth? And going back to those conversations that the manager is having, thinking about that higher performance coming from a combination of our self-awareness, our ability to self-reflect, and then in doing so, our self-regulation. So how we actually deploy those behaviors at work. So as a manager, am I coaching the individuals in my team through those 3 different stages, and providing a space and a safe space for them to do that piece of reflection? Big question, big answer.
It's a big question. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we don't have time for more, although I'm seeing a lot more questions. But, feel free to connect with us on social media. Drop us a line. We'll be sharing also the slides after the webinar, so you can feel free to look at them and send us some more questions and thoughts. I hope you enjoy this. I want to thank our 2 panelists, Nelson and Ali. And that's it. Wish you all a nice rest of the day, whether you're starting it, finishing it, or midday of it. Thank you.
Thank you.